Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, sponsored by the National Health Association. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and today I'm very delighted to have as my guest Dr. Sarah Lake. Sarah is the CEO of Tilted Collective, which is a kind of global initiative attempting to really promote sustainable plant-rich food sources on the planet to really address the issues associated with climate change, food insecurity, and health. And Sarah, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, and I acknowledge your doctorate because I always acknowledge people with PhDs. They don't get enough acknowledgement. I know the work that goes into that. Let me address something because to just a little background on you. I noticed that early in your life, there was an experience with a major health situation with your dad, for example, that really started the ball kind of rolling more in the direction of the health considerations around plant ways of eating. So talk a little bit about that, because like you and I, we grew up in households where meat was the focus of our meals, and you had that kind of revelation after your dad's crisis and his bypass. So talk a little bit about that if you can, just as a segue into where we can go.
Certainly. So I grew up like a lot of Americans in a meat and potatoes household. We had meat at a lot of meals when I was younger. And a big part of it was my grandparents. My grandparents grew up, post World War II, and meat was a commodity that you sought after. It was a sign of privilege and a sign of wealth. And so my dad was raised in that same culture, and meat was a big part of our household. And then when I was about 11, my dad had a massive heart attack. It was pretty traumatic in terms of a sudden onset. He had had a unhealthy diet for quite some time, and a lot of it was from eating a lot of meat, and he required 6-way bypass surgery. And so it really stuck out with me as a moment that occurred in our life of seeing him in the hospital. And I tell the story in my TED Talk of sitting in a hospital where the only food that we could access was a McDonald's to eat, greasy hamburgers while my dad was having open heart surgery from largely an unhealthy diet. And after that happened, my mom really kicked in and said, it's so clear that your food choices, or our collective food choices, were influencing our health. And so she pretty much banned a lot of meat from our house. So I grew up in a largely plant-based household, and that really shaped my views on food and made me question why we eat what we eat, and realizing how much of it was just sort of assumed that you would eat meat without thinking through what the implications were. Obviously, it was more convenient to eat meat a lot of the time. My mom was, almost single-handedly raising 3 kids and doing so on a budget. And it's hard in order to find convenient, cheap food that isn't animal-based. But she made it a priority to have, healthier proteins in our house and a lot of plant-based options that institutionalized for us the idea that we needed to be eating more plants. I was exposed to things like broccoli and kale and Brussels sprouts early in my life, and only realized probably when I was in my 20s that a lot of other people had never even tried a lot of these foods because they'd never been offered to them. So it really changed my understanding of the way in which our food choices are shaped for us, and luckily had that health experience turn out okay. My dad's still alive.
That's great.
And a big part of that's because our diets changed early on, where we had the opportunity to eat more plant-based foods.
It's funny, I go back long before you. I remember a time at McDonald's when they used to have a running tab of how many burgers had been sold.
Yeah.
So they'd have that banner saying, 40 billion burger. It was just hilarious to me at the time. I mean, I was wild that they would act. It was almost like a telethon. When you have that money collected, they would have the actual running tab of the numbers of burgers that were sold. When I looked at what you had done in some of the early research that you did, even in your PhD work, dealing with economic sociology, you were looking at the harm environmentally and socially of what you called livestock supply systems. Basically, you did research on that. So let me ask you, how did you segue from those early stages of eating plant-based into that consciousness of wanting to direct your attention in a research project at what you did? What were the aha moments? What was the impetus that segued you into that interest?
Yeah. Part of why I first started studying cattle was because it literally stunk in the air. So I lived in Colorado, and I still do. I'm in Denver, and I live not too far from one of the world's largest feedlots. And
Okay.
when it snows, everyone knows it's going to snow because you can smell the wind coming from the north over the feedlot. And so it's very present even in an urban environment that we have these massive livestock operations. And so as someone who was studying supply chains, it was hard to ignore and to say, why do we have these massive feedlots and what's happening in our food system? So I became really interested in looking at the local cattle production in the US, but also looking at the role of massive corporations in shaping our food choices. I had been studying global economics for a while and looking at the role of massive corporations from everything of clothing manufacturing and sweatshops to food production, and wanted to understand how these big companies were shaping our food production and the experience of farmers and ranchers. I spent a lot of my childhood on a farm and always felt for small scale farmers who I could see were struggling. So I was curious, how were these big companies, the Chipotles, the JBSs of the world,
Mhm.
shaping these supply chains? So through that process, I was funded by the USDA to study these supply chains and understand the environmental impacts, as well as how farmers and ranchers were faring in them. And through that process, really got deeply engaged with companies and did a lot of engagement with them to understand their sustainability practices. I spent most of my career looking at corporate sustainability and asking the question of how companies could help us do more in terms of climate solutions. And after almost a decade of working specifically on deforestation, we were asking the question really of, how can these companies help us get deforestation out of our meat supply chains, knowing so much animal feed is coming from Brazilian Amazon rainforest,
Right.
knowing that a lot of cattle are raised in the Amazon, but generally there's a lot of deforestation linked to our food system. But then realized that this was the wrong question, that we were asking, how to get deforestation out of our food system rather than saying, how do we get meat as a whole out of our food system? It's not just about deforestation, and that our food system was sort of destined to fail with how much growth was expected in meat consumption. And really pivoted to say, this is the focus. This is the crisis of our lifetime, is to answer the question of how we're going to feed 10 billion people by 2050, but do it using half as much land, a fraction of the water, and a fraction of the other resources required to produce food.
Yeah, so that's a major piece. And I love in your brilliant TED talk, the idea is, many times we think we're operating just from the standpoint of personal choice without those government and corporate factors that are literally shaping what's available to us and driving us to choose what they want to make available. And so you make the point that one of the forces that has to happen is that as much as we've had, the directive in the past to drive meat and animal product choices, we have to have that attention from governments and corporations to drive plant rich choices. And I really resonate with that because it's not just a personal choice issue. We tend to not look at these over-ending factors that are driving some of these social and economic drives. I mean, subsidies is one of the great drives that we could actually talk about. The fact that since the New Deal of FDR, subsidies have been in play. People don't realize it's not a new thing. It's something that goes back decades and decades in our corporate mentality. And the fact of the matter is, how are you going to get, if you're not subsidizing fruit and vegetable growers effectively, and you're driving up the prices of those products while you're subsidizing the cost of meat, which you make the point, and I've seen before, would be about $30 a pound if it wasn't subsidized. How do you shape those forces that reshift the subsidy process? Let's talk about that, because the truth of the matter is that makes it less available, less affordable, which are always the two things that drive poor choices, or when people are moving away from plant exclusive eating. the mentality is, well, it's too expensive and it's not available. So, how do we reshape those forces from the subsidy standpoint? Talk to that a little bit if you can.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky to change subsidies because, like you point out, these subsidies have been in place for a very long time. And there are a lot of forces that benefit from these subsidies, right? The meat industry is benefiting massively. The dairy industry benefits massively. But what we can do is point out the systems that don't benefit. And there's two that are huge. One is most farmers and ranchers are not benefiting from the subsidies. So when you look at it, the subsidy dollars being paid to them are just enough for them to survive. But the average American farmer still has $200,000 of debt. Right. So this is not actually supporting our farmers and ranchers as much as it's supporting major, massive mega farms and the corporations behind them. And the other part is our subsidies are supporting wildly unhealthy foods. So we're spending trillions of dollars on healthcare globally that is from preventable disease. And there's a way in which we can reshape the subsidy conversation to say, we're actually spending subsidy dollars to pay people to then spend more on healthcare, right? The absurdity of that logic of we are actually using taxpayer dollars to make people sicker and then have to spend more.
It's horrendous. It's just horrendous.
Yeah. And so a lot of people don't understand necessarily the agricultural elements of subsidies and, how do we talk about it in those terms that make sense? But when we talk about it in terms of farmers and ranchers are suffering and our healthcare system is suffering and people are suffering, it makes it more tractable. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do to try to shift subsidies, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there as well in terms of some of the pressing issues that we're going to face one way or another. One of the big ones is food security. We're not going to be able to produce the same amount of meat with the current level of subsidies because the cost of production is only going up and up and up. Part of it's the climate impacts, right? We're running out of water to produce animal feed. Here in Colorado, we're using more than 70% of water from the Colorado River just for animal feed, and the river's running dry. So at a certain point, we are seeing the price of feed skyrocket, and therefore the subsidies don't go as far. And we can't just endlessly funnel, government subsidies into this industry. There's a point at which we need to explore plant-based options as being a more efficient and effective way of feeding our population. But it is quite hard because it's seen to be, what the status quo, and going against anything that's a status quo is tricky. And often people are more quick to scrutinize those changes.
I'm here with Sarah Lake. We're going to take just a short break to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association, and we will be right back. You're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. Dr. Frank Sabatino here. Are you ready for an extraordinary adventure that combines relaxation, exploration, and vibrant health? Then set your sails for the NHA plant-exclusive cruises. Imagine cruising through exotic destinations, savoring delectable plant-based cuisine, and engaging in rejuvenating activities, all while surrounded by like-minded individuals passionate about health and wellness. These cruises offer more than just a vacation. They offer an opportunity to immerse yourself in the NHA's principles of healthy living. And they rank incredibly high on the ratings of eco-friendly cruise lines. We all know how important our oceans are, and our cruise partner, Windstar, is fully committed to this. Join us aboard our upcoming plant-exclusive cruises and experience the synergy of health and leisure. Delight in gourmet SOS-free meals prepared by talented chefs. Attend informative workshops and enjoy the serenity of the sea, all tailored to nourish your body, mind, and spirit. For more details and to reserve your spot on our next adventure, visit healthscience.org and click the link under travel. Don't miss this chance to indulge in a wellness retreat like no other. Elevate your well-being and make memories that will last a lifetime. And remember, your feedback matters. Please take a moment to leave a rating and a review wherever you're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Frank Sabatino, your host. Now, back to the show. Welcome back to the Health Science Podcast. I'm here with Dr. Sarah Lake, who's the CEO of Tilt the Collective, a global initiative to promote sustainable plant-rich food choices. Let me take a step back with all this too, because part of the drive in terms of food choices have been the corporate drive for decades to feed the process of food addiction in the culture. Let me just touch on that briefly, because I think as we talk about shifting the focus of attention to different kinds of sustainable dieting and eating, we go back into the 60s and 70s. You had food conglomerates like Kraft and General Mills and so on. They would hire these people that were called psychophysicists back then, like Howard Moskowitz, who would look at what was the combination of things like salt, oil, sugar, crunchiness that could be put into a food supply to trigger what he called back then the bliss point. What was the way we can influence the greatest number of people to be somewhat addicted to the products and processed food products, which many of them were also animal-based because they had animal parts and animal things in them. So those things were set in motion and they still operate today. So groups like the NHA try to advocate not only a plant-rich way of eating, but also trying to eliminate salt, oil, sugar, trying to really work through those components that are triggering this brain reward cascade that feeds addiction and drives people to make choices that are not in their best interest. Mm-hmm. Back then, while they were talking about the bliss point, they didn't really have a handle that they were feeding the pandemic of obesity, but that's actually what happened. Yeah. So let's talk about how that now gets superimposed on the kinds of directives you're trying to shift. How do you factor in those corporate pushes to promote food addiction to the very products that people need to shift away from for their own personal health?
Yeah, it's an issue everywhere that companies are pushing unhealthy foods, whether it's the fat, sugar, sodium combination, or it's certain additives, or it's just simply promoting what's going to make them the most profit. It's something where certainly regulation has a major role to play. There's new regulation, mostly, we see it in Europe, for example, of banning advertising of meat products on public transportation or banning advertisements of junk food, because we know these products are addictive and we know they're unhealthy, but there isn't enough regulation of the industry or of the way in which they're promoted. We're starting to see some of this, right? There's examples with like sugary foods in the US where you can't promote certain sugary foods on television to kids in a way that would drive unhealthy habits, but it's so limited, even though we have the science that shows it's problematic. Ultimately, my belief is this largely is due to the influence of big food and meat companies on policy. We know that most of our policy environment in the US is heavily influenced by lobbying, by the direct placement of industry members on committees or in government, and that it doesn't allow for sort of the science behind it to rule in the best interest of people. Instead, we're having many policies that are advancing the interests of these massive companies. One of the best examples recently that I find incredibly alarming is last week or the week before, JBS, the biggest meat company in the world, announced that they're investing $2.5 billion to expand factory farming in Nigeria. So they're developing massive meat processing facilities and the supply chains to supply them. So we'll have new chicken, pork, and beef factories in Nigeria. And it's one of the most food insecure countries in the world. So 1 in 8 Nigerians are food insecure, and it represents nearly half of the population of all of Africa. But somehow this is assumed to be a good thing. There's a lot of public attention saying this is great for food security, when in reality, they're promoting these really unhealthy animal-based products and doing so in a way that's going to use even more resources in a resource-scarce environment. So where in a country like Nigeria, where we need to be producing as much food as possible with as little resources as possible, we're actually doing the opposite, which is allowing JBS as a company to massively expand meat production because we assume that is somehow the healthy solution where there's food insecurity. And I think it's a similar narrative in the US of we're assuming it's okay for these companies to advance, these processed products because it's what people want, without recognizing that it might not actually be good in the long run in terms of meeting health goals, climate goals, or food security goals.
Yeah, that phrase food security is always funny to me. It almost to me kind of soft soaps the problem of starvation, which is really what it is. And the truth of the matter is, when we look at it, we've got 1 billion people starving worldwide, and people think it's only in third world countries, not realizing we have about 50 million people starving in the US, and about 15 million of those are children, which is really a startling statement to make in a Western nation like the US. Let me ask you a question, though. Let's talk about, I'd love for you to talk about Tilt the Collective and how that evolved, and as a scientific, advocate program initiative, and talk a little bit about what the goals and the methodology is of that collective. What is it that you're really trying to achieve, and how are you actually setting in motion things to achieve those goals?
Yeah, happy to talk about Tilt Collective. I want to say one thing on your previous point, because I think, Frank, what you said is so profound when you talk about food insecurity in the US. Because in the US right now, 1 in 5 children are food insecure. At the same time, 1 in 5 children are obese.
Right.
So what does it say of our food system that we have both those problems at the exact same time? Obviously, there's some overlap between those two,
Right.
but it's a food system that is neither working for our health or for actually feeding people. And it's wild that we overlook it and somehow think we should continue the status quo. But that's partially why Tilt Collective exists. So Tilt Collective came about recognizing there is a massive opportunity to advance a more plant-rich food system that helps us meet both our climate goals as well as feed a growing population. This is based on the back of research from the IPCC, the most renowned climate research group in the world, that shows there is no way we can meet a 1.5 climate scenario and at the same time feed 10 billion people with the way that we're producing food today. The only way we can do it is if we fundamentally reduce the production and consumption of livestock. Our approach at Tilt is to say this is not about people choosing differently, like we touched on. We have been pleading with people for decades to make healthier, more sustainable choices, and it doesn't work. Meat consumption is only going up and up and up. So our approach is to say this is actually about getting companies and governments to offer and incentivize more sustainable and healthier options that makes it easy for people to choose differently. You mentioned it earlier as well, that if these products that are healthier, more sustainable are not widely available, if they're not the same price, if they're not presented to people in the main places where we eat food, we're never going to get uptake of those. So we're asking the questions of how can we look at the main places where food is offered, whether that's supermarkets, schools, hospitals, and push companies and governments to offer these products in a way that encourages consumers to take them up. That can be through policy change, like subsidies that help change the price. It can also be through city level commitments to have plant-based defaults in our hospitals. So we explore an array of strategies that are suited to each particular context and work with local organizations to help advance these strategies. Technically, Tilt Collective, we're a regranter, which means we fundraise at a very high level and then issue grants out to leading organizations across all of the countries in which we work globally in order to advance different strategies that are very specific to each context. So we recognize that the strategies that are going to work in Brazil are very different than what will work in the US. And the food system that's needed in each context is different. We eat very different food here in the US than we might in other countries, and wanting to make sure that we're advocating for a food system that is both sustainable and healthy, but culturally relevant and appropriate for each context.
Sarah, let me address two things with you. And one is that when we talk about influencing government changes that can redirect our attention to more plant-rich options, we have a sense that governments by nature are altruistic, and we know that that's not the case. So, I was talking with Silesh Rao from Climate Healers at one point, and he made the point that when you look at the IPCC, the International Governmental Panel, their focus, even through the FAO, which is their research arm, the Food and Agricultural Organization, they still tend to want to focus on carbon emissions as really the main problem and really circumvent the true problem, which is much more rich, which is our dependence on animal agriculture and industrial animal production. So he brings up in his work that the FAO had conflicts of interest by being kind of in bed with meat and dairy industrial components that are redirecting the attention away from the real cause of the problem, which is much more dependent on animal food production. Do you feel that that's a valid argument? And how do you see overcoming those hidden agendas on a governmental level? And how would something like even your group make any attempt to kind of shift the attention or the focus of that?
Yeah, it's absolutely a problem. I think many governments are working very closely with meat industry or dairy industry, and there is not a strong separation that creates the accountability we need. We've seen this in the development of the FAO roadmap. There was a lot of criticism when the FAO created a roadmap for sustainable food systems that it did not fully recognize the role of livestock, and it didn't make recommendations about reducing livestock production. In fact, it sort of emphasized what the role of livestock should be and how much we needed it. And part of that is because there are relationships and there are vested interests within the meat and dairy industry. It's hard to overcome. I think part of our job is to, one, produce other science to show, right, have the right data and information that shows the compelling evidence outside of what's coming from governments. And the second is to name and call out where there are these conflicts of interest and to demand some of that separation. One of the best models we can learn from in advancing a plant-rich food system is actually tobacco, because tobacco is so similar in terms of our addiction to meat. It was, right, 20, 40 years ago, it was a highly addictive social and cultural issue that people said it's going to be impossible to get everyone to stop smoking. And yet here we are today where smoking is banned in most public places and public institutions. There's lots of regulations. And in fact, in policymaking, there is a firewall between tobacco industry being in the room. So I think there's lessons to be learned of how we create similar regulations and similar accountability mechanisms to minimize the role of the industry within these decision-making spaces.
There's another area that's of interest to me. I went through and looked over that article you had published on the transformation of global food systems, the idea of the return on investment of philanthropic input in shifting and moving the needle. So here's my question, and tell me what you think about this. If we're battling sometimes the government's desire to spend money to make these shifts, does gathering funds philanthropically from public and private domain, is that something that can move the needle even in the face of the restrictions of governmental change? I'm just curious about how you view that. And do you see that as an option if we're really hitting stalemates with the choices governments are making, that these side issues of, real philanthropic contribution can override that and actually move the needle in the direction we need to go?
Absolutely. The philanthropic investment is critical in terms of spurring other investment as well. So there is lots of research that shows that philanthropy can help open the door and de-risk investment from either venture capital or public investment as well. Right. And so that's actually a critical role for philanthropy to play, is to actually spur greater investment. Obviously, we have other sectors where we've seen the same thing. There's been lots of philanthropic investment in electric vehicles or in renewable energy that has helped to create the pathway for further investment to come. So even when government isn't maybe initially interested in this, there is a massive role for philanthropy to play in paving that pathway and encouraging government investment. One of the things that we do at Tilt Collective is this research to help show the value of investment. So sometimes for policymakers, it's not always clear why this is something they should give money towards. And we can help make the case for that. As you mentioned previously as well, part of this is about climate, right? I'm here as a climate advocate. Right. But for most policymakers, they don't care about climate, right? Most consumers don't care about climate. If you poll people and you say, what's top of your concerns? Climate is not one of those. It's cost of living, it's health of their family, it's health, their own personal health. And so for policymakers, there's an opportunity for us to show that this investment is not actually about climate. It's about these other issues that resonate more closely with their political agenda as a policymaker. That might be public health. It might be food security and the cost of groceries in the grocery store. So that's our job, is to help communicate why this is an investable project, but needing the initial philanthropic investment to help make that case.
Yeah, I found it interesting, and we can reinforce the data points to this audience, that when that in that article that I referenced, that Philanthropic, our return on investment, that the plant-rich changes were 5 times greater in terms of reducing carbon emissions than renewable energy sources, electric vehicles, and all that. So it was really a very profound analysis to really show the really important impact of these food choices over more conditions of like burning fossil fuels and things of that nature. And that was a real interesting thing that came out of that article for me.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, how do you, what are, just from my standpoint as a scientist, how do you quantify those changes? What's the mechanism or the methodology for quantification?
Yeah, so we're looking at the emissions reductions from simply producing and consuming less meat, as well as the additional benefits. So what we look at includes things like you're actually addressing food loss and waste at the same time. So if you're consuming less meat, you are also wasting less meat, for example.
Right.
So there are benefits from food loss and waste. We're also considering some changes to production practices within that model. But ultimately, the emissions reduction is so big because this is not about trying to make a more sustainable cow. This is simply getting rid of the cow altogether. And when you look at projected growth of meat consumption, that is the biggest emissions risk that we have, that we're looking to exponentially grow meat consumption globally. So this assumes that we are actually, lowering the overall growth. And within that, in terms of the methodology we look at, it also includes the repurposing of the land saved. So if you're no longer using the land to grow feed for the animals or to raise the cows, you can actually turn that land back into carbon sinks. So you
Right.
get a win-win. That is, both you're saving the emissions from the cow burps and from the actual, harvesting of forests for production, and then putting that land back into a carbon sink that helps increase the carbon savings of it. It is quite shocking when you look at the numbers that it's 5 times renewable energy. But what's even more shocking to me is when you look at the current levels of investment and the fact that such a tiny fraction of the need for plant-rich food systems is met, even though it has this outsized potential. But that speaks volumes to how this is such a political and cultural issue where people are afraid to talk about shifting away from the status quo meat system, even though it could be, one of the silver bullets in terms of climate and food security.
Before we go on, let people have an idea. Where's the URL that they can find you, learn more about your work, Sarah? Could you say it twice? It's going to scroll across the show notes.
Absolutely. You can find us at tiltcollective.org. That's TILT collective.org. You can also find us at the similar hashtag on Twitter and on LinkedIn to hear about what we're up to and follow us for updates.
Yeah, you made a point in your TED Talk, and these points have been made before to some degree, that Americans are eating 6 times the amount of red meat that's really should be allowable. And the fact that that's generating both health and climate concerns, we understand that. When you talk about a plant-rich system, it becomes a little bit abstract. So I'm trying to get an idea from you. When you say reducing meat consumption, what are you actually quantifying? What is the quantifying amount that the house is burning right now? So what's really going to be that amount of reduction that's going to really, in your mind, really create a solution, rather than people going 100% vegan or plant exclusive, which isn't going to happen? But how much reduction do we really need to move the needle into a safe zone?
Yeah, it's a really important question because we're not talking about getting rid of all meat tomorrow and saying everyone has to be vegan tomorrow. What we use as a baseline is the recommendations from a group that's called the Eat Lancet Commission, and they produce a report called the Eat Lancet Report. And what it does is it looks at what is the diet in particular regions and countries that both respects the environment and the climate goals and simultaneously meets health goals. So pretty much asking the question of how are we addressing our climate crisis and simultaneously feeding ourselves in a healthy way. And so those recommendations vary by animal product and in particular cultural contexts. And largely it's quite a very small amount of red meat, a little bit of chicken, a little bit of pork, and a little bit of dairy, a larger amount of fish in certain contexts. You can look at the report they have out now, and they'll release a new version of it in October of this year. But within that context, a lot of it is actually just talking about overconsumption. To your point, in
Right.
the US, we eat 6 times the recommended amount of red meat. And what we can do is just address the overconsumption. This is consumption against our current dietary guidelines, which, to be quite honest, our dietary guidelines right now allow for a lot of meat consumption. So we're talking about even 6 times what is a very high bar. And that alone is we can address without talking about people having to significantly reduce beyond that. That alone has massive climate
Well, let me
benefits.
ask you a question. Let me play devil's advocate. If the entire world reduced their entire animal product consumption by half, would it save the planet?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the
You
short
think
answer is yes.
you think it would do that? Okay,
Yeah.
that's an interesting point.
It's a question of who is reducing their diet. If everyone did it, yes. But a
Right,
great statistic is in the US, 50% of all red meat is eaten by 12% of the population.
right, right,
Right. And
right.
these are white men over the age of 40 who have high school degrees but did not go to college. Right. This is a very specific demographic
Right,
we're talking
right,
about.
right.
So it's a question of who are we targeting and recognizing there's actually a lot of inequality within a country, right? In the US, like we're saying,
Yes.
a lot of people are overeating meat and a lot of people are wildly food insecure. So trying to focus on those people who have the highest levels and bringing that down to a reasonable amount based on the dietary guidelines recommended in each context.
And as you make the point, the more we can make plant-rich options more affordable and available, that of course drives the population to want to make those kinds of sustainable choices. You've got to really deal with that mindset. But there's another piece to this too. If we stopped all eating of animal products, we still have the incredible industrial use of animal body parts for all kinds of accoutrement, whether that's clothing, upholstery. So we don't seem to address those, but there are millions of tons of animal parts that the economies have become used to producing, whether it's upholstery for this or clothing for that. So how do we move from just through the food choices into those economic or directions to really start to shift that mindset about why do we need these kinds of animal body parts to really produce clothing and upholstery and all of that? That's a whole other level, but it's involving millions of pounds of animal parts.
Yeah, it's an important question, particularly when you look at the economics of meat production. One of the critical products that makes or breaks the profit of slaughtering a cow is the leather. If
Right.
you can't use the leather, it actually is really difficult to turn a profit on slaughtering cows because the value of the leather is so high. But we know there's substitutes to all of these. It's an important consideration to say, well, what are we doing about all of these other uses? But we know that there are substitutes available. There's lots of vegan leather or vinyl substitutes for it. And similarly, there's a lot of technologies that we can explore, but we haven't yet, right? So I was just talking to a colleague about researchers who now can produce casein, the ingredient for cheese, out of soybeans, that you can
Right.
get a soybean to produce that. This we know we can innovate around, but the problem has been the lack of investment in the research and development to create these because there hasn't been the demand or the mandate to do that. But it is a complete question of not just the food products, but the other associated uses of these
And,
animals.
and to your point that you even made in your TED talk too, there are now so many companies offering plant-rich sources and choices of clothing and those kinds of options. I mean, I got to do professional stuff. I got to do dress up every so often. So all my closet are all of those things. They become so much more available and actually quite more affordable too, which is kind of nice. So that kind of is moving the needle a little bit on that other side of inhumane animal treatment, just to generate products for accoutrement in the culture. So
Yeah.
all of that's available more, just as you made the point that in certain countries, more of the burgers are now plant-based. They're more, once you make these products closer to the price of what the animal-based products are, and you make them available in kind of a nice competitive way for the consumer, the chances are that there will be more purchase and more directed use of those products rather than having them unaffordable or less available.
Exactly. And we've seen this with other food products. It's so helpful to step back and say, we have not always eaten meat. We have not always worn leather. And leather was never, sold at Walmarts and these massive retailers. This is a new invention relatively. And we've seen the same with other food products. One of my favorite examples is quinoa. right? Quinoa is something we in the US never ate until probably about 10 years ago. And now you can go to a fast food restaurant and find something that has quinoa in it. And this was simply because the companies promoted it. There was a large cultural shift in influencers in the healthy diets and the sort of clean eating. And so we can see the same around lots of plant-rich options. The problem is it just isn't happening fast enough. And so the question is, how do we get companies and governments to do the same for lots of plant-rich products that exist today? We don't have to invent our way out of this. Like, we have many of these new food products, but people aren't yet seeing them because there's not enough promotion. Like blended.
It varies so much country to country, which is kind of interesting to me because, and it's a good question. Like, I spent a lot of time in England and the UK and certain parts of Europe in my travels, and it's interesting to me to see the explosion of veganism in those cultures and countries in many ways compared to our own. So how do you process the different mindsets of those countries that are actually making more or less options available? Is it just that America has been so entrenched for so long in a certain way that it's a more of a threshold that it has to overcome, compared to the fact that I may be in England and just about every restaurant has a litany of plant options, even if it's not a vegan or vegetarian restaurant?
Yeah, it's a really important question to ask, of what's influencing consumers to want more plant-based options in these markets. And I think a big part of it is the broader political economy. And what I mean by that is, what are the forces that are shaping what we choose and why? In the US, I think one of the main drivers of why we don't have those options is because we have extreme issues with poverty and food deserts. People don't have access to food, and people generally are trying to spend as little as possible on
Right.
food because we have such high levels of poverty. So people want the McDonald's Big Mac that's as much food, protein, grease, and fat within their $5 budget as possible. In other markets, like in the UK, groceries are subsidized to such a point where it's actually less of a price gap to do the
Right.
plant-based.
Yeah, if you can get a 99-cent hamburger, you're not going to spend $6 on a pint of raspberries. Let's be realistic. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So that's part of what drives that. And I see that, and it's a problem.
Yeah. There's other cultural factors, in terms of when we look at Germany and why a lot of Germans support more plant-rich diets. A big part is that there's attention on animal welfare that is deeply rooted in the meat system, and also a high attention on quality products, that there is a cultural tradition of German high quality meat production where there's resistance to sort of the crap processed McDonald's approach. That's like, let's just have really terrible meat products. They want higher quality, and that shows sort of the traditional German cuisine. So there's more attention on how meat is raised, how it's produced, and therefore sort of more opportunities to say this isn't working, and we can explore sort of plant-rich eating. It is tricky in each culture, though, because there are driving forces behind why people are choosing what they're choosing, and also different diets, right? Like and we work in Thailand, for example, and there, right, the diet is largely centered on poultry and seafood. So it's less around what are the driving forces of cattle and hamburgers in the hamburger culture than what is a, culturally appropriate Thai cuisine.
You and your organization are really a global initiative. So you have an outreach that goes far out. And not only that, as you said, you're involved with organizations and funding, and you have your hand and finger on the pulse of a wide variety of directions that are trying to change and move this needle. So in the face of the anxiety and unsettledness of the American population and even the younger population, do you feel hopeful? Let me just ask you that question in terms of the solution to what we're trying to solve, not only in climate, but in, food insecurity, health issues. How do you sit from the standpoint of hope in what you're seeing and how your company's been doing its thing?
I love that question, and I love hope. I would say I am hopeful, and part of that is out of necessity. I have a 6-year-old, and I have to be hopeful that his future is going to be brighter. I think the other reason I'm hopeful is one lesson I've learned of being in the climate movement for so long is there is always a business case. There is always money to be made. And I fundamentally believe that capitalism is going to drive our solutions in the same way it has with electric vehicles and solar panels and broader renewable energy solutions. So I see the same in terms of this plant-rich diet shift, that there is enormous money to be made, and these companies will start moving on that. One of my favorite examples of this is through JBS. They're the world's largest meat processor, and they largely work in beef and pork. But alternative proteins are a whole new field, and they started developing fake fish sticks. And for them, this is an enormous business opportunity. They have never sold fish products before, and they've never been able to sell products to vegans and vegetarians. And so this is making them money hand over foot in the Brazilian market. It's their fastest growing food segment. Mm-hmm. And that shows that there is value for them in investing in plant-based options, even when their core business model is really about meat. There is still this opportunity for them to explore and really move into a different direction. So I think that gives me hope in maybe a slightly twisted way that
No, I understand. Money, let's face it, money talks and cows walk. That's going to be the best way to go. You know what I'm saying? So let me ask you a question. As we wind this down, Sarah, what are some final words you'd like to really share with the audience out here?
Yeah, I think what I would share is, as people listen, this is not about your personal choice. I think it's about recognizing your power to demand to actually have more choices given to you by companies and governments. And that is the movement I would like to see emerge in the next 5 or 10 years, is people recognizing that our choices are being taken away to the detriment of our own health and our family's health. And the companies and governments that offer us food have a responsibility to offer us more sustainable and healthy options, and that we can start calling on them to do that. I think the other thing I would say is to stay tuned for more coming from Tilt Collective. We'll be doing a webinar in January that's on our 5 big ideas for 2025. What are we most excited about? And really shining a light on these points of optimism where we're seeing unprecedented progress towards plant-rich food systems, and even in places where people said it could never be done. So really trying to highlight that this is happening. It's just a question of how fast it happens and if it can happen at the rate we need in order to meet our food goals and our climate goals. Because people are already starting to eat more plants, and the climate impacts are also going to force that one way or another, because we simply can't keep producing pigs and chickens and cows using the same resources we are now indefinitely. There will be a natural end to this, and we're hoping to be proactive to usher this transition in a way that avoids as much harm to people and animals as possible.
So you left us with a teaser. I like that. That's good. I can't thank my guest, Sarah Lake, enough for joining us today, the CEO of Tilt Collective. I urge you to follow Tilt Collective. I urge you to follow their webinar that's coming up. Just pay attention to the work that they're doing. It's going to help us all really move in creating a really sustainable plant-rich future, which we really need to solve some of the major problems that we're suffering with today. And I want to thank the people that have joined us today for being part of this active, healthy community. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I look forward to being with you on the next episode of the Health Science Podcast. Sarah, thank you so much for your time, really.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.